Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the classic original 62 book series. And it's book number 44, Say Cheese and Die Again. Oh boy. I know how controversial this Goosebumps book is in the Goosebumps community. It's quite commonly touted as one of the worst Goosebumps books of all time for a lot of fans out there. But I'm going to be upfront and honest. Even after this most recent time reading this book, it's been a long time since I've actually sat down and read Say Cheese and Die Again. I think the last time I read it, I was 12 years old. Just like then, I didn't hate it as much as other people did, or have said they still do, till this day. You know what I mean? This is one of those books that I think aren't necessarily underrated. I'm not saying this book is underrated by any means, but I definitely think it's hyper conflated, at least with certain aspects of it. And I'll get into that in my review portion of the video. But I still don't think that this book ever deserved to be made. I mean, as a sequel to Say Cheese and Die, I think a Say Cheese and Die sequel with Greg possibly could have been something worthwhile if Stein had a solid idea. But considering this was way later in the original 62 lifespan, and this book came out, I think, in the most busiest time period of R.L. Stein's career in 95 and 96, where a lot of these books that he was putting out around this time were suffering from quality consistency issues. And a lot of the time, especially with books from the 40s, I've noticed this more so a trend in the original 62, having tremendous pacing issues and kind of a scatterbrained plot, and the sequel books not really following up all that much to the originals, or they're just blatant rehashes. I don't know what to think of this book. Like, honestly, I have all over the place opinions, but would I recommend Say Cheese and Die Again to the average Goosebumps fan? Well, I will say this. I think there's a reason why this book isn't in print today. So this is a book that you would have to buy a 2003 reprint or the original copy of to actually have in your collection. Unless you want to read all the books in the series, or maybe you're a massive fan of Say Cheese and Die's original book, there's really no need to read this, because this is the only other time you're ever going to see Greg Banks, the main character of the Say Cheese and Die original book, ever again in the series. So if you want one more story with him, by all means, check it out, but you really could skip this one and be fine. So yeah, now I'm going to get into the plot overview, where there will be spoilers. So if you haven't read the book before, now's the time to, click off and maybe go read it and then come back, okay? So the plot of this story picks up, I think a few months after the events of Say Cheese and Die, the original book, where there's been a few months, I don't know exactly how long. I think the first book took place in fall or winter, or maybe spring. It wasn't summer, I can tell you that. And this book takes place, later in the school year, presumably before summer. So, because grades are coming out at this point of the story. And Greg is realizing that he is about to flunk his English class at the end of the year, because his teacher, Mr. Sauer, has given his class a book report to write something about a true experience that you went through. And Greg took the assignment to heart and decided to be completely upfront and honest about this unbelievable journey he and his friends Sherry, Bird, and Michael went through in the first book, and shared it openly in front of his class, even in front of these two, I guess, new bullies. I don't think these are the same bullies from the original Say Cheese and Die. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, he tells a story, and Mr. Sauer, his teacher, kind of makes fun of him, along with the class, that are just gobsmacked by what Greg is saying about this camera, and how he went to this old house up on the top of the hill of the neighborhood that they live in. I think it's called Pitt's Landing. I don't know why I can remember that name, but it just sticks out in my memory for some reason. I guess it's because I read Say Cheese and Die, the original book, so much as a kid. But he tells a story about how him and his friends broke into this old home on top of the hill that was condemned, essentially. And they were noticing that this creepy hermit named Spider or Spidey. I think he goes by Spidey in the book. Spider, I think, is his name in the episode sequel. But he's sharing the story about how he goes down into Spidey's lair and finds the camera with his friends. And, Greg, of course, takes the camera thinking that it's cool. And then, of course, chaos ensues when he takes it home and it snaps a picture of his family's car and he gets into a car accident. And then he takes a picture of his friend Sherry and she disappears. He takes a picture of his friend Bird at a baseball game and he gets injured and knocked out really badly on the baseball field. And he's open and honest about what he had to do in the situation and, his journey through that. But before he can get down to the point where we know what happened to Spidey by the end of it, Mr. Sauer cuts him off and essentially says, hey, Greg, you're pulling all of our chains. This story can't be real at all, and I'm going to have to fail you for this assignment. So after class, Greg goes up to his teacher, Mr. Sauer, and he's like, hey, you can't fail me. I was being completely honest. Look, I have a summer trip with my family that's, in another state, and I could just spend the whole summer with them if I pass this course. I need you to pass me because I know the story's hard to believe, but I'm telling the truth. So Mr. Sauer, I guess, gives him like an empty promise by saying, okay, Greg, here's the deal. If you can bring me the camera and prove that this camera is evil, like you said in your story to the class, I'll change my mind and I'll give you an A. So Greg, he realizes that he's put in the situation where he's going to have to go back to this house and he's going to have to get the camera again. But once he learns that information and he goes to his friends in the hallway and he interacts with these bullies that kind of make fun of him for his story with like a fake disposable camera, at the lunchroom, he's telling his friends about what he's going to have to do to get the camera. And his friends, Michael, Bird, and Sherry, are like, you're stupid if you go back and get the camera, Greg. And Greg's like, well, I just need it for one day. I just need to go back and get it so I can prove to him that the story is true. And then I'll take it right back there and it'll be hidden again. We don't have to worry about it. Mind you, there's no mention of what happened to the bullies at the end of the cliffhanger of the first book. We don't know any mention of them. And the characters seem to all remember all the ordeals they went through, but not necessarily touch on what happened to Spidey. But Greg's like, all right, well, I guess I'm going to have to do it myself after he begs his friends to go along with him. So he decides to braven up and gets on his bike, later that day, I guess, or maybe the next day. I forget, but doesn't really matter. He goes over to the hill where the condemned house is said to be at. But when he gets up the hill and he gets onto the property, he sees that there's a for sale sign and it says sold. And the house that used to stand there on the property is completely gone. And the only thing left of the old house is old shutters and nails all over the property. And he realizes that, well, the camera was hidden in the basement, so maybe it would be a good idea to check to see if the basement is still on the ground. But when he goes to check, he sees that it's just a massive pit of nothing. And when he's looking around the area, he's greeted by this boy named John. And John is this new kid that's moved to the town of Pitt's Landing. And he reveals to Greg that he and his father have recently moved here. They bought the property, but his dad realized that the house looks unfixable. And because the house has associated legends with it being haunted and all of that, it just helped for the family to make it easier on themselves by just tearing down the house and building a new one, let's just say. Well, the demolition crew had taken out the whole basement area and had thrown away a bunch of stuff. And when Greg mentions to John, hey, did you see a camera down here by any means or by chance? And he's like, yeah, but I think they threw it away in the garbage. So Greg goes and peruses through the garbage and finds a dead raccoon in the garbage, which freaks him out. But underneath the raccoon is the camera, and he pulls it out, and he's excited to see it. And when John sees the camera, he's like, whoa, that's a really cool vintage-looking camera. And Greg's like, hey, man, I just need it for one day. And he's like, you know what? Maybe I should ask my dad about this, because if I don't and this thing ends up being valuable or an antique, he might be mad at me. So Greg is starting to panic because he's like, oh crap, I need this for my grade. And in the moment of panic, he snaps a picture of John without thinking. And when he looks at the photo, John's like, whoa, 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 you took a picture of me? And they both look at it, and his eyes are closed and his mouth is open, and he looks like he's in pain. Well, John ends up stepping on a massive nail that goes right through his foot, and it causes this injury of blood to squirt out of his shoe and all that, which is really graphic for Goosebumps, I should say. And this whole scene catches the attention of his father and other workers in the area when John starts to blurt out in pain after Greg is seemingly trying to get away with the camera. And John is taken away in a van and taken off to the hospital, and Greg's kind of left there by himself with the camera on his person. Well, he takes it back to his house, and when he gets there, we get caught up to speed. I forget if this is the point of the story where we learn about his brother, but his brother from the previous book has a job working as a, he deals with, making photos, and he can make negatives and all that stuff at a photo shop. And that's where he works, which might play a role later on in the story. Well, Greg, he's kind of stewing on what happened to John, but he's like, all right, well, the camera's already taken its first victim. I need to take the camera immediately to school the next day so I can get this over with and get this, hidden away again, or give it back to John, or maybe not even give it back to John because the camera's too evil for him. And when he takes the camera to school the next day, he realizes that his substitute teacher is there instead of his teacher, Mr. Sauer. And he's like, oh, crap, well, now I'm stuck with this camera. And to make matters worse, when he has the camera in hand, which plays a role, I guess, later on, right? He is out walking one day, and his friend Sherry stops him. And he accidentally takes a photo of her. And when the photo comes out, it looks like it's a negative, right? And she begrudgingly is really upset with him that he took a picture of her, and she decides to, take one of him back. But when he gets his photo, he looks like he, according to the book, this is what makes the book controversial, weighs 400 pounds, right? So with this in mind, for the remainder of the story, as the next day comes around, Greg notices that he's starting to gain a little weight, right? And he wants to take the camera back to class again in hopes that Mr. Sauer is going to be there to show him that the camera is indeed evil, and prove to him with these photos that have been taken of him and Sherry and, this random kid named John. Well, when he gets there, he notices that he's had to already adjust what he's wearing at school. He's wearing baggy clothes, and his fingers are getting fatter, and he can't get the photos out of his pocket to show the evidence to his teacher. And the teacher's like, well, these photos look fake, right? And even though he has the camera on his person, he knows that something more drastic needs to be done to kind of prove to him the scenario. Well, once Mr. Sauer kind of writes him off and officially says that Greg's got an F, this is where the story kind of spirals from that point, because there's an aspect to the first book involving how to deal with the pictures that the characters are kind of forgetting about. And as we see Greg and Sherry, who have been affected by the camera, I guess in a retroactive sense compared to other experiences with certain characters with the camera in the past, Sherry's losing weight at an alarming rate, and her clothes are falling off, and her parents have taken her to a doctor, and it seems like the doctor's only prescribed that she eats protein bars and stuff. And Greg gets taken to the doctor, and his parents think it might be an allergic reaction to something, but his doctor's dumbfounded by this rapid rate gain, and it just keeps getting worse in the story. And it gets down to a point where Greg and Sherry realize that they have to fix the situation before it gets too dire. And they get to a point where we get near the end of the story where they've started getting unrecognizably big and skinny. And of course, Mr. Sauer has taken it upon himself just to humiliate Greg in this scene, in the same scene where he declared that his grade was an F in front of everyone. And Greg realizes that his life's only going to get worse, and he's going to keep gaining weight because of the photo. And Sherry's going to get skinnier and disappear and fly away, as the book would say. So they get desperate, and they start chatting about possibly ripping up the photos. which I think was a way that they got rid of the photos effects in the first book, if I'm not mistaken. That could be a major spoiler, but like I said, if you haven't read the book before, you should have clicked off. So instead of doing that, they seem to think that that could be a terrible idea, given that the effects they're going through is a bit different. So they decide to go to Greg's brother, who works at the camera shop, to develop the photos. But since Sherry's photo was a negative, he can develop that into a positive photo, and they can take Greg's positive photo and turn that into a negative and reverse the effects that way. And that possibly may or may not work out in Greg and Sherry's favor, which leads to the ending of the story where we get caught up to speed and Greg still has the camera. And, you know, there is a whole scene where Greg kind of interacts with John after we haven't seen John since he was rushed off to the hospital, asking where Greg was, because I guess he's looking for the camera. And Greg's lied to him. So Greg still has the camera on his person, but he wants revenge on a specific person at school that humiliated him. And he decides to take it there and show him or her. And I'm not going to be too specific because I don't want to spoil everything here. But he tries to make a whole spectacle in his classroom about it, and possibly ends up backfiring on everyone. And before we get to see what entails of that, the story fades to black, and that's essentially all you're going to get out of this book here, Say Cheese and Die Again. So I'm going to say this up front, right? For the little positives I have about this book, I will say this. For a follow-up to Say Cheese and Die, I think the setup to this story and the reluctancy of Greg wanting to go back to this house to get the camera and feeling like he's kind of forced himself into the situation because of his own dumb logic to begin with. But at the same time, you can't really blame him for, you know, having to do this because, you know, it's really dumb for him to just decide to share a true story about an unbelievable thing that probably no one would believe. You would think that he would have some hindsight into that, and later on in the book he kind of shows that he does. But nonetheless, what Greg goes through and has to deal with the camera in this story, at least in terms of having to get it, I think works fine, because why on God's green earth would Greg ever actually want to get the camera? You know, he feels like he's forced to get it in this situation, and then for a random idea for Stein to come up with to execute that for a follow-up, I guess works technically, so it's fine on that regard. And I will say, I would say maybe the first 7 or 8 chapters are pretty decent, actually, especially when we get introduced to the character John and get caught up to speed about the backstory of the house getting demolished. And while we have no idea what actually happened to Spidey, given the events of what happened in the first book, it's only implied from there that, you know, I have to get into mild spoilers, that Spidey possibly got killed by the camera. The follow-up to that would be, obviously, Greg knew some roundabout area where the camera was hidden down in the basement. And I think Stein did take some shortcuts to kind of go over the fact that 2 of the bullies in the first book did actually go down there and find the camera. While those characters are never brought up in the book, getting rid of that aspect and Greg possibly going through the manicness of being like, oh crap, the camera's not here, what happened to it? And go down that whole rabbit hole of him discovering that these 2 other kids went missing, which probably would have been a better angle to go down anyways for the story. And maybe Greg is trying to prove that the camera possibly had something to do with these kids going up and disappearing, for thought. But I think that was a kind of a cool angle with the John character not knowing anything of the history and just knowing where the camera is, and seeing the dead raccoon scene was gross, and the nail through the foot scene was really cool and gory for Goosebumps standards, and that was pretty tense. But once you get past that point of the story, it kind of falls apart. It falls apart at a rapid successive pace, right? It seems like, now we're getting into the negatives, all the characters in the first story, you know, you have Michael, Bird, Sherry, Greg's brother, at least all the characters that were in the know of what the camera was and what it was doing and what happened in the first story, specifically with Spidey, they all know the dangers of the camera, but they all seem to forget what got them out of the situation in the first place. it was ripping up the photos. Now, I will say Stein, another clever workaround he did in this book was having the kids be technically forced not to rip up the photos because Greg needs those photos as evidence because he'd rather use those to show his teacher that the camera is evil than actually take a picture of somebody in the class and risk somebody else getting hurt, which is quite novel of the character. And I think it's quite clever on Stein's part for doing that. But once that element is taken out of the story where Mr. Sauer essentially writes it off and says, well, you got an F, you would think that Greg and Sherry would be like, okay, well, I failed. Might as well rip up these photos and try something else. They don't do that. They just sit there and contemplate like, oh, maybe this is a bad idea. What makes you think it's a bad idea? Is it the fact that your experiences are different than the first time around and not recognizable to other phenomenon that happened? Or is it because you just completely forgot that that was a thing until later on in the story? I couldn't tell you, but it's really dumb when you sit down and think about it. And the whole new aspect of making a positive photo a negative and making a negative a positive is, I guess, a cool angle. But then again, it just feels like Stein is doing his classic sequel approach of throwing things out into the ether to subvert expectations. Because if you read the first book, you're expecting them to rip up the photos. But because this is a sequel, he wants something different in there. So he has this new approach, which I guess is cool. And you have setup and payoff with the brother Terry. I think that's his name in the story, so kudos to that. But why? Why? It's just so random, right? And going to the ending of the book, the ending, it just ends on a weird note. And in my opinion, I think the final chapter or two takes away the legacy of Greg Banks for me for a little bit. Even though I totally get his perspective, given the situations he went through in the story, when he was getting bigger with his peers and wanting revenge on this specific person, I just don't feel like that feels in character to Greg. You know what I mean? He just felt like an average cool kid in the first book, but here, kind of humanizing him a little more and humiliating him, birthed a vengeful jerk. And you're just like, really? I guess that's all she wrote for Greg Banks. And I just don't like the way the book sends that off, right? But the biggest sin I can say about this book is why this book is so controversial is what happens to the characters. And yes, Sherry, what happens to her is an inflection on maybe eating disorders like bulimia, anorexia, and stuff like that. But nobody makes fun of her. The only people that get made fun of are big people in the book, like what you call obese or what have you. There's nicknames for two bullies in the stories that are called Sumo 1 and Sumo 2. And when Greg starts going through this phenomenon, his own friends, Bird and Michael, I think chime into the echo chamber of these kids at the park where they're trying to play and call him Sumo 3 and 4 because he's so much bigger than his bullies. And not to mention, the terminology used in this book to describe, obese people, I can totally see why people hate this book for that, because, Goosebumps should be about escapism, and, we can sit here and deliberate what's appropriate in kids' horror all day long. But at the end of the day, people who happen to be bigger or obese, like coming from experience, when I first read this book as a kid, I was definitely overweight compared to my other peers in my class. And before I started taking medication that kind of took back my appetite and I started to lose weight, I was made fun for being big, and then I was made fun of for being a twig when I started to grow taller. So damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? People don't want to be reminded of realistic trauma that I guess they go through in day-to-day life. And what Greg goes through from his peers in this book, and even his own teacher, I think goes beyond, right and wrong of what you should do to people. And it's outright hateable. It's outright hateable. It makes you completely hate Mr. Sauer, and you want something awful to happen to him, which might be playing into the ending and what Greg has going for him. But still, you don't really want Greg to do this because he's better than that and should be above that. But yeah, some of the comments and things thrown at his way while he was going through weight gain was kind of messed up in this book. But I will say there is some brevity and levity to his monologue in the story, because he realizes that, wow, people really are jerks to people that are, bigger, and he kind of admits that, and there's some catharsis in that, especially if you grew up in a similar situation. It's hard to explain in the super case specific. Maybe you can plug yourself into, him growing bigger to possibly some other thing that develops in your adolescence that you weren't expecting, that might make you different than others. Who knows? You could possibly plug that into Greg's character and like it a bit more than it is outright explicitly put. But I will say that has not aged well, and yeah. But in terms of like a functional sequel, this book breaks the cardinal rule that a lot of Goosebumps sequels break, and that is going down the sequelitis route of having plot amnesia for the sake of it, having plot convenience, and delaying the inevitable conclusion just to throw that conclusion out the door to subvert expectations with a new twist and rush that, right? And I will say this on a technical thing. This book is a short and sweet, I think like 113 pages. This book flies by, but there is some pacing issues. Like, it feels like Stein is just rushing through this to get it over with. It feels like there's some scatterbrained ideas in here that aren't quite fleshed out. And I honestly think the biggest missed opportunity with this book, and I mentioned this a little bit beforehand, instead of going down the whole, two-trick pony that this book has about Sherry growing skinny and Greg going fat, essentially, it should have been about Greg, adding on to the ending of that first book and, telling a true story. And this uncovers this legend that, oh, yeah, you were responsible, or you must have been associated with what happened to those two kids. And Greg could have just tried to prove his innocence to not only his peers, but maybe the law that might be coming down on him, right? You could have made this story a bit more serious, and him getting the camera, he needs that for evidence to people. So if he can show and prove himself that, maybe these boys somehow got stuck in the camera, or the camera did something to him, that he can clear his name. I think that would have been maybe too mature for a Goosebumps book, and maybe too thriller-esque and not enough horror. But I would have rather gotten that kind of book than what we got here. And at the end of the day, do I think that Say Cheese and Die Again is outright hateable? Not really. Does it have hateable quality? Sure. But I don't think this is a good book by any means. It's not a great follow-up whatsoever to the first book, because it doesn't really do anything exciting or new with it other than just tweaking the concept and how to handle the situation. And even then, the situations we get with the camera in this book are so drawn out. We only get like 3 pictures being taken in the whole story. I guess if you want to throw a 4th one in near the end of the story, sure, but there's not a lot being done here, and it's depressing. I feel like the first book had a little more stakes and a little more thrills with that. But all in all, yeah, this book was kind of a wash. I don't really think this is even a meh book. I think this is quite bad, given all the problems I have with it. So, from a 0 to 5 star basis, given all the problems I have with it, I decided to be mean on it a little bit, and I deducted from 5, 2.3 off the top, and I gave it a 2.7 out of 5, which is a D- to me. But it's like a middle of the road D-. I've read worse in Goosebumps, and I've read a little bit better in this similar category. But yeah, it's not the worst book ever, but I totally get why it's not in print now, and why most people, kind of bash it. And it's honestly probably one of the most forgettable Goosebumps sequels ever made, so take that for what you will. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Say Cheese and Die Again. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.